The wind screamed through the Appalachian night, clawing at Harold Hal Grayson's cabin with icy fingers as he stumbled toward the door, lantern in hand. A sharp crack split the air, a tree branch snapping under the weight of snow and gale-force winds, crashing somewhere too close in the dark. The thermometer outside his frost-rimed window had plunged to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, a number that burned into his mind as the glass rattled violently. Hal's breath fogged in the dim light, his heart pounding as he peered into the swirling white void beyond. Something was coming, a storm unlike any he'd faced in his 5 years here, and it carried a menace that made even this hardened recluse tremble. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The cabin creaked under the onslaught, its wooden bones groaning as if pleading for mercy. Hal stood still for a moment, the lantern's weak glow casting long shadows across the room. At 45, he was no stranger to the wild moods of West Virginia's Appalachian Mountains, but this night felt different, darker, heavier, as though the land itself held its breath. He set the lantern on the rough-hewn table, its flame flickering like a heartbeat, and moved to the fireplace. The embers glowed faintly, their warmth barely reaching the corners of the modest space he'd called home since leaving Pittsburgh behind. 5 years ago, Hal had traded the clamor of city life for this solitude, a choice born from grief and a need to hear his own thoughts again. He'd been a wildlife photographer then, his lens capturing the raw beauty of wolves and hawks, his name known in galleries from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. But when his father, Walter Grayson, passed, a man who'd taught him to read the land like a book, Hal packed his gear, sold his apartment, and drove west until the roads narrowed and the world fell silent. The cabin, perched on a ridge miles from Elkins, became his outpost, a solitary dot amid the endless roll of snow-draped hills and ancient oaks. Now, as the wind battered the walls, Hal knelt by the hearth, feeding logs to the dying fire. The wood crackled, spitting sparks that danced briefly before fading into ash. He rubbed his hands together, calloused from years of chopping firewood and hauling water, and glanced at the frost creeping across the window panes. Outside, the night was a chaos of white, the snow falling not in gentle flakes but in thick, relentless curtains that swallowed the landscape whole. He'd seen storms before, harsh ones that buried his truck and kept him inside for days, but the ferocity of this one gnawed at him, a primal warning he couldn't shake. Hal rose, his knees creaking, and crossed to the small desk where his weather radio sat, its antenna bent from years of use. He turned the dial, static hissing, before a voice broke through, clipped and urgent. This is the National Weather Service with an update for Randolph County. A historic blizzard is moving south from the Ohio Valley, bringing record low temperatures and winds up to 50 miles per hour. Expect whiteout conditions and extreme wind chill through tomorrow night. Stay indoors and prepare for prolonged isolation. The broadcast cut to a whine, then silence, leaving Hal staring at the device as if it might offer more. He knew what this meant. The nearest town, Elkins, was 3 hours away on a good day, a twisting drive through passes that would now be impassable. No one would come for him, not the rangers, not the neighbors he barely knew. In this corner of the mountains, survival was a solitary art, one he'd mastered through careful routine. He turned from the desk, his shadow stretching across the wall, and began his preparations with the steady hands of a man who'd faced nature's wrath before. First, the supplies. Hal opened the pantry, a narrow closet lined with shelves, and took stock. Cans of soup, beans, and peaches. Enough for weeks if he rationed. A sack of potatoes sat in the corner, their skins wrinkled but still good. He moved to the water jugs next, filling 2 from the hand pump by the sink, knowing the pipes might freeze despite the heat tape he'd wrapped around them last fall. The task was mechanical, his mind half elsewhere, replaying the radio's warning like a loop. Record lows, 50-mile winds. Words that carried weight, each one a brick in the wall of dread building inside him. The fire was his next concern. Hal stepped outside briefly, the cold hitting him like a fist as he hauled an armload of firewood from the stack under the eaves. Snow stung his face, driven sideways by the wind, and he squinted against it, the world beyond his porch a blur of white and shadow. Back inside he dumped the logs by the hearth, shaking flakes from his coat. The pile was generous, he'd spent the fall splitting oak, but he wondered if it would be enough. A storm this fierce could trap him for days, maybe longer, and the thought sent a shiver through him that had little to do with the chill. He paused, catching his breath, and let his gaze drift to the walls. They were lined with photographs, black and white prints from his old life, a moose wading through a stream, a bear rearing against a sunset, a hawk mid-flight. Silent companions, they'd followed him here, reminders of a time when he'd chased beauty through the wild rather than hiding from it. One frame stood out, a shot of his father, Walter, standing beside a river, his weathered face creased with a rare smile. Hal could almost hear his voice now, low and steady. Nature doesn't forgive carelessness, Hal. Respect it, and it might just respect you back. Those words had kept him alive more times than he could count, a mantra etched into his bones. But tonight, respect felt like a fragile shield. Hal crossed to the window again, wiping a hand across the glass to clear the frost. The thermometer's needle hovered at -35 degrees Fahrenheit, a stark red line against the black, and he knew it would drop further before dawn. The oaks beyond swayed wildly, their branches clawing at the sky, and he wondered how many would fall before morning. The storm was still gathering strength, its full fury yet to unleash, and Hal felt the weight of it pressing down, not just on the cabin, but on him. He turned back to the room, the fire now roaring, casting a warm glow that clashed with the cold seeping through the walls. His satellite phone sat charged on the desk, a lifeline he rarely used, its signal spotty in weather like this. The ranger station near Elkins was 50 miles off, too far for help if things went wrong. Hal had learned to live with that distance, finding a strange peace in the quiet moments between storms. But tonight that peace was slipping, replaced by a hum of unease he couldn't name. As he settled into his chair by the fire, the wind found a gap in the cabin's frame, whistling an eerie tune that set his nerves on edge. He pulled a blanket over his shoulders, the wool rough against his skin, and stared into the flames. The night stretched ahead, long and unyielding, and he knew sleep would be a stranger. Something was coming, something more than snow and wind, and it tugged at the edges of his awareness like a thread he couldn't quite grasp. Outside, the first heavy gusts of the blizzard roared down the ridge, shaking the cabin to its foundation. Hal's eyes flicked to the window, where the snow had thickened, blotting out the world beyond. The storm was here, and with it, a challenge he couldn't yet see. The chapter closed on that note, the fire crackling, the wind rising, and Hal sitting in the glow of his lantern, waiting for whatever the night would bring. The wind's howl grew sharper as the afternoon wore on, slicing through the Appalachian stillness like a blade. Harold Hal Grayson stood at his cabin's frost-covered window, watching the snow fall in thick, relentless sheets that blurred the world beyond. The thermometer outside trembled at negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit, a number that seemed to mock the thin walls of his shelter. Inside, the fire roared, its heat battling the cold that seeped through every crack, but Hal felt no comfort. The oaks beyond his porch swayed wildly, their branches groaning under the weight of ice and wind, and he knew this storm was only beginning to flex its muscle. He turned from the window, his boots scuffing the worn floorboards, and moved to the small table where his lantern flickered. The light danced across the room, illuminating the photographs lining the walls, snapshots of a life he'd left behind. A hawk soaring over a Pennsylvania ridge, a bear lumbering through a meadow, each image a silent testament to the man he'd been. But it was the memory of Ruth that lingered now, her voice cutting through the years. "Animals have souls, Hal," she'd said once, her eyes bright with conviction over coffee in a Pittsburgh diner. He'd laughed then, brushing it off as sentimentality. But today, as the storm tightened its grip, her words echoed with a weight he couldn't dismiss. The radio crackled again, pulling him from his thoughts. He adjusted the dial, static giving way to the same clipped voice. Winds increasing to 60 miles per hour by evening. Temperatures expected to drop further. Power outages reported across Randolph County. Hal's jaw tightened. Power wasn't his worry. His generator hummed faithfully in the shed, but isolation was. The road to Elkins was a ribbon of ice by now, and no one would brave it in this. He was alone, as he'd chosen to be. But the storm's ferocity made that choice feel less like freedom and more like a cage. He crossed to the pantry, double-checking his supplies. The cans gleamed dully in the lantern's glow. Soup, beans, a tin of peaches he'd saved for a rare treat. He ran a hand over the sack of potatoes, their rough skins a small comfort. Water jugs lined the floor, filled to the brim, and he nodded to himself. Routine kept him steady, a rhythm he'd perfected over 5 winters here. But as he stacked another log on the fire, the wind found a new pitch, a shrill wail that set his teeth on edge. He paused, listening, and felt the air shift, thicker, heavier, like the moment before a thunderclap. Outside, the snow piled higher, drifting against the porch in waves. Hal pulled on his coat, the wool stiff with cold, and stepped into the storm for more firewood. The wind hit him hard, driving snow into his eyes, and he squinted as he grabbed an armload from the stack. A branch snapped somewhere in the dark, the sound sharp and close, and he froze, heart thudding. The world was a white blur, the trees mere shadows in the chaos. Back inside, he dumped the logs by the hearth, shaking snow from his sleeves, and caught his breath. The storm was building, and with it a sense of something lurking just beyond his sight. He settled into his chair, the blanket pulled tight around his shoulders, and stared into the fire. The flames leaped, casting shadows that danced across the photographs. Ruth's voice returned, softer now, almost a whisper. "Souls Hall. You'll see it one day." He frowned, shaking his head, but the unease wouldn't lift. The wind rattled the cabin, a relentless fist against the walls, and he glanced at the window. The snow had thickened, swallowing the last traces of daylight, and the thermometer's needle seemed to shiver in place. Whatever was coming, it was closer now, and Hal felt it in his bones. A whisper of something wild and untamed, waiting in the dark. The wind's howl grew sharper as the afternoon wore on, slicing through the Appalachian stillness like a blade. Harold Hal. Grayson stood at his cabin's frost-covered window, watching the snow fall in thick, relentless sheets that blurred the world beyond. The thermometer outside trembled at negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit, a number that seemed to mock the thin walls of his shelter. Inside, the fire roared, its heat battling the cold that seeped through every crack, but Hal felt no comfort. The oaks beyond his porch swayed wildly, their branches groaning under the weight of ice and wind. And he knew this storm was only beginning to flex its muscle. He turned from the window, his boots scuffing the worn floorboards, and moved to the small table where his lantern flickered. The light danced across the room, illuminating the photographs lining the walls. Snapshots of a life he'd left behind. A hawk soaring over a Pennsylvania ridge, a bear lumbering through a meadow. Each image a silent testament to the man he'd been. But it was the memory of Ruth that lingered now, her voice cutting through the years. "Animals have souls, Hal," she'd said once, her eyes bright with conviction over coffee in a Pittsburgh diner. He'd laughed then, brushing it off as sentimentality, but today, as the storm tightened its grip, her words echoed with a weight he couldn't dismiss. The radio crackled again, pulling him from his thoughts. He adjusted the dial, static giving way to the same clipped voice. Winds increasing to 60 miles per hour by evening. Temperatures expected to drop further. Power outages reported across Randolph County. Hal's jaw tightened. Power wasn't his worry. His generator hummed faithfully in the shed, but isolation was. The road to Elkins was a ribbon of ice by now, and no one would brave it in this. He was alone, as he'd chosen to be, but the storm's ferocity made that choice feel less like freedom and more like a cage. He crossed to the pantry, double-checking his supplies. The cans gleamed dully in the lantern's glow. Soup, beans, a tin of peaches he'd saved for a rare treat. He ran a hand over the sack of potatoes, their rough skins a small comfort. Water jugs lined the floor, filled to the brim, and he nodded to himself. Routine kept him steady, a rhythm he'd perfected over 5 winters here. But as he stacked another log on the fire, the wind found a new pitch, a shrill wail that set his teeth on edge. He paused, listening, and felt the air shift, thicker, heavier, like the moment before a thunderclap. Outside, the snow piled higher, drifting against the porch in waves. Hal pulled on his coat, the wool stiff with cold, and stepped into the storm for more firewood. The wind hit him hard, driving snow into his eyes, and he squinted as he grabbed an armload from the stack. A branch snapped somewhere in the dark, the sound sharp and close, and he froze, heart thudding. The world was a white blur, the trees mere shadows in the chaos. Back inside, he dumped the logs by the hearth, shaking snow from his sleeves, and caught his breath. The storm was building, and with it, a sense of something lurking just beyond his sight. He settled into his chair, the blanket pulled tight around his shoulders, and stared into the fire. The flames leaped, casting shadows that danced across the photographs. Ruth's voice returned, softer now, almost a whisper. "Souls, Hall. You'll see it one day." He frowned, shaking his head, but the unease wouldn't lift. The wind rattled the cabin, a relentless fist against the walls, and he glanced at the window. The snow had thickened, swallowing the last traces of daylight, and the thermometer's needle seemed to shiver in place. Whatever was coming, it was closer now, and Hal felt it in his bones. A whisper of something wild and untamed, waiting in the dark. The night deepened, and the storm's fury reached a new pitch, shaking the cabin as if it meant to tear it from the ridge. Harold Hal Grayson sat by the fire, the blanket slipping from his shoulders as he leaned forward, ears straining against the wind's roar. The lantern on the table flickered, its light dimming as if cowed by the chaos outside. Past midnight, the world beyond his walls was a void of white and shadow. The thermometer lost to frost, but it was the sound that jolted him upright. A low, guttural growl, barely audible over the gale, yet unmistakable. A bear. In February, in this killing cold, a bear was awake and close. He rose, slow and deliberate, and crossed to the window, wiping a hand across the glass. Frost flaked away, revealing a swirl of snow that danced in the lantern's faint beam. Then he saw them, 3 dark shapes moving through the whiteout, their forms hunched against the wind. A mother bear, massive even in her weariness, led 2 cubs, their small bodies stumbling in her wake. Ice clung to their fur, glinting like shards of glass, and their movements were labored, each step a fight against the storm. Hal's breath caught, fogging the pain as years of wildlife observation flooded back. Bears didn't roam in winter, not here, not now, unless something had gone terribly wrong. He pressed closer, the cold seeping through the glass into his palms. The mother bear's head hung low, her powerful frame reduced to a shuffle, and the cubs clung to her sides, their legs trembling. They were too small, likely born late in the season, and the storm was a death sentence they weren't built to survive. Hal's mind raced, a snowslide, a fallen tree. Something must have ripped their den apart, forcing them into this frozen hell. He'd seen desperation in animals before, photographed it through his lens, but this was different. This was raw, visceral, a mother's fight laid bare. The bears drew nearer, their shadows stretching toward the porch. The mother paused, lifting her head, and Hal swore her eyes met his through the glass, dark, exhausted, pleading. His heart thudded, a drumbeat against the wind's shriek, and he stepped back, hands flexing at his sides. Every rule he'd lived by flashed through his mind. Bears near cabins were danger, pure and simple. He'd heard the stories, hunters mauled, homes torn apart, and he'd preached caution in his old life, teaching others to keep their distance. But those eyes held no threat, only a quiet, desperate need. The cubs huddled closer, one letting out a weak whimper that cut through the storm's din. The mother turned, nosing them gently, her movements sluggish as if each breath drained her. Hal watched, rooted to the spot as she pawed at the snow near his steps, trying to carve a hollow against the wind. The effort was futile. The gale whipped away every flake, leaving nothing but a shallow scar. The cubs shivered violently, their small frames curling inward, and Hal felt a pang deep in his chest, sharp and unbidden. He turned to the fire, its warmth a stark contrast to the scene outside, and ran a hand through his graying hair. Walter's voice echoed in his ears. "Respect nature, Hal, but don't meddle." His father had been a practical man, a woodsman who knew the line between man and beast. But Ruth's words followed, softer, insistent. "They have souls." Hal clenched his fists, torn between the safety of his walls and the sight of those trembling shapes. The mother bear's growl came again, fainter now, a sound of fading strength that pierced him like a blade. The lantern's flame dipped, casting the room in half-light, and Hal glanced at the photographs on the wall. A bear stared back from one frame, proud and wild, a moment he'd captured years ago. This was no proud beast. This was a family on the edge of oblivion. He moved back to the window, breath shallow, and saw the cubs sink lower, their movements slowing. The mother stood over them, her bulk a fragile shield, and Hal knew time was slipping away. The storm roared on, relentless, and in its howl, he heard a question he couldn't yet answer. What would he do when the moment came? The wind battered the cabin with unrelenting fury, its wail a constant roar that drowned out all but the faintest sounds. Harold Hole Grayson stood frozen at the window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the mother bear claw at the snow near his porch. Her massive paws moved with a desperate slowness, scraping at the drifts in a futile bid to shield her cubs from the storm's bite. The snow whipped away as fast as she dug, the wind a cruel thief, and the cubs huddled closer to her, their small bodies trembling beneath a crust of ice. Hal's chest tightened, each shiver of theirs, a silent plea that echoed in the stillness of his mind. The lantern behind him flickered, casting jagged shadows across the room, but its light couldn't pierce the darkness outside. The mother bear paused, her head lifting as if sensing his gaze, and those eyes, deep, hollowed by exhaustion, locked onto his. Hal felt a jolt. Not of fear, but of something deeper, something Ruth had once tried to name. "Animals have souls," she'd said, her voice soft over the clink of diner cups. And now in the mother's stare, Hal saw it. A fierce, unwavering love. A mother fighting with all she had left. He stepped back, hands trembling, the weight of her desperation pressing against him like the cold through the walls. The cubs were small, too small for a winter this harsh, their fur matted with ice that glinted in the faint beam of his lantern. One let out a weak cry, a sound so fragile it barely reached him, and the mother nosed it gently, her breath a faint cloud in the freezing air. Hal's mind churned, piecing together the story. A den collapsed under snow, a tree felled by wind, something that had driven them into this nightmare. He'd spent years tracking bears, photographing their strength, but this was no proud stride through the woods. This was survival stripped bare, and it shook him in ways he hadn't expected. He turned to the fire, its crackle a stark contrast to the scene beyond the glass, and rubbed his hands together, the warmth doing little to ease the chill in his bones. The photographs on the wall stared back, wolves, moose, bears, all moments he'd captured without interfering. Walter's voice cut through the haze. "Nature runs its course, Hal. Don't cross that line." His father had lived by that, a man of hard edges and harder lessons, but Ruth's words tugged at him too, pulling him toward a choice he didn't want to face. He glanced at the satellite phone on the desk, useless in this storm, and knew no help would come, not for him, not for them. The mother bear resumed her digging, her movements slower now, her strength visibly fading. The cubs pressed against her, one stumbling as its legs gave way, and she nudged it back with a tenderness that belied her size. Hal's throat tightened, his hands flexing at his sides. Every rule he'd learned screamed at him. Bears this close were a threat, a danger he'd been taught to avoid. But those rules felt distant now, hollow against the reality of 3 lives slipping away in the snow. He pressed his forehead to the glass, the cold biting into his skin, and watched as the mother's efforts faltered, her body sagging under the weight of the storm. The wind howled louder, rattling the cabin's frame, and Hal felt the air shift again, heavier, as if the night itself were closing in. The cubs' shivers grew weaker, their small forms curling tighter, and the mother let out a low moan, a sound of despair that sliced through the gale and straight into Hal's core. He stepped away, heart pounding, and looked around the room. The fire, the photographs, the life he'd built here. What was it worth, he wondered, if it meant standing by while they died? The question hung there, unanswered, as the storm raged on, pulling him toward a precipice he couldn't yet see. The cabin trembled under the storm's relentless assault, the wind a savage force that shook the walls and drowned the fire's crackle. Harold Hal Grayson stood at the window, his hand resting on the door handle, the cold metal biting into his palm. Outside, the mother bear hunched over her cubs, her massive form a crumbling shield against the blizzard. One cub lay still, its small body half buried in snow, and the mother nudged it with a gentleness that broke Hal's heart. The second cub stumbled, its legs buckling, and she let out another moan, weaker now, her strength draining into the frozen night. Hal's breath came fast, fogging the glass, as he watched the thermometer's needle vanish beneath a layer of frost, beyond -40 degrees Fahrenheit, a killing cold. The cub's shivers slowed, their small chest barely rising, and the mother's eyes met his again, glassy with exhaustion. There was no wild fury there, no threat, just a resignation that hit him like a blow. He'd seen hypothermia before, photographed it in a deer once, but this was different. This was a family dying in slow motion, right on his doorstep, and he couldn't look away. His mind raced, flipping through options like pages in a book he'd read too many times. Stay inside, stay safe. That's what Walter would say, his voice a stern echo. Don't meddle, Hal. Nature doesn't need you. But Ruth's words pushed back, soft and persistent. They have souls. He saw her now, her gray hair catching the diner's light, her belief unshaken. Hal gripped the handle tighter, torn between the man he'd been, a careful observer, and the man this night was forcing him to become. The cubs were slipping, the mother fading, and time was a thread unraveling fast. He stepped back, glancing at the storage shed through the connecting window. A small room, insulated, once his dark room, now a clutter of old gear. It had heat, a faint hum from the generator, and a separate door to the outside. It could be a refuge, a chance, but the risks loomed large. A bear inside, even weakened, could turn on him in an instant. He'd seen what they could do. Claw through wood, snap bones, and the storm would trap them together for hours, maybe days. Yet as the mother's head sagged, her cubs motionless beneath her, Hal felt the rules crumbling under the weight of what he saw. The wind screamed, a branch cracking somewhere in the dark, and Hal's eyes darted to the photographs. A wolf pack stared back, lean and hungry, a shot he'd taken in Pennsylvania years ago. He'd watched them then, let them starve without a hand outstretched, believing nature should run free. But this wasn't a distant lens, this was here now, and the mother's gaze held him captive, pleading in a language older than words. He turned to the fire, its warmth mocking the cold beyond, and felt a decision solidify, sharp and inevitable. He moved to the desk, grabbing his coat and gloves, the wool stiff against his skin. His hands shook as he pulled them on, not from cold, but from the gravity of what he was about to do. The satellite phone sat there silent, a lifeline he couldn't use, and he ignored it, stepping back to the window. The cubs were still now, their breaths faint wisps in the snow, and the mother's eyes began to close, her body slumping forward. Hal's voice broke the silence, a whisper to himself. I can't watch you die. The words hung there, a vow, as he turned the handle and felt the storm's breath rush in, pulling him toward the unknown. The door creaked open and a blast of icy wind roared into the cabin, stinging Hal Grayson's face like 1,000 needles. Snow swirled in, dusting the floorboards as he stepped onto the porch, his breath snatched away by the storm's ferocity. The mother bear lay just feet away, her massive form hunched over her cubs, their small bodies nearly lost in the drifts. Hal's heart pounded, the cold biting through his coat, but he forced his voice to stay low and steady. "It's all right," he murmured, the words more for himself than the bear, as he gripped a thick blanket from his emergency stash. The wind howled, drowning his voice, but he kept his eyes on her, watching for any sign of threat. She lifted her head, nostrils flaring as she caught his scent, her eyes glinting in the lantern's faint beam. Hal froze, every instinct screaming at him to retreat. Bears were unpredictable, even weakened ones, but she made no move to charge. Her gaze held a weary awareness, dulled by exhaustion. And he saw the cubs beneath her still and silent, their fur crusted with ice. He took a cautious step forward, the snow crunching under his boots, and tossed the blanket gently toward them. It landed over the cubs, a patch of wool against the white, and for a moment the mother tensed, her muscles rippling beneath her matted fur. Hal held his breath, knowing his life hung on her next move, but instead of lunging, she nosed the blanket closer, tucking it around her cubs with a tenderness that belied her size. Hal exhaled, a cloud of vapor in the frigid air, and moved again, slower this time, laying another blanket closer to the storage shed's door. The shed stood 10 feet away, its outline barely visible through the snow, a haven he'd once used to develop photographs now humming with the generator's heat. He opened the door wide, warm air spilling out in a fleeting fog, and stepped back, his hands trembling from cold and nerves. The mother bear's head lifted higher, her snout twitching as she sensed the warmth, a flicker of life in her fading strength. Hal kept his movements deliberate, non-threatening, his voice a soft hum against the wind. "Come on, just a little further," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't understand. The cubs hadn't stirred, their small forms motionless under the blanket, and time was slipping away. He stood near the shed, the wind nearly knocking him off his feet, and watched as the mother made her choice. With agonizing slowness, she rose, her legs shaking under her weight, and gripped the blanket in her teeth. Hal's eyes widened, awe overtaking fear, as she began to drag her cubs toward the shed, each step a battle against the storm and her own collapse. The distance was short, but it stretched into eternity, her powerful frame trembling with every move. The blanket slid over the snow, the cubs bundled within, and Hal stood rooted, hardly daring to breathe. The wind gusted harder, snow stinging his face, but he didn't flinch, his gaze locked on her struggle. She reached the threshold, her bulk filling the doorway, and paused, steam rising from her fur as the warm air hit it. Hal's heart thundered. This was the moment of truth. If she panicked now, trapped in close quarters, there'd be no escape. But the cold and her cub's need outweighed her fear. And with a final heave, she pulled them inside, collapsing beside them as the heat enveloped their frozen bodies. Hal moved forward, slow and careful, and eased the shed door shut, the latch clicking into place. Through the small window, he saw her curl around her cubs, her eyes still open, watching him with a quiet intensity. He stepped back into the cabin, the wind slamming the door behind him, and sank into his chair, hands shaking, as he pulled the blanket around his shoulders. The storm raged on, but inside the shed a fragile hope had taken root, and Hal knew he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. The night wore on, the storm's peak rattling the cabin with a violence that shook the walls and sent shivers through the floorboards. Harold Hal Grayson sat by the fire, the blanket slipping as he leaned toward the connecting window, his eyes fixed on the shed. The lantern cast a soft glow, its light barely reaching the glass, but he could see them. The mother bear and her cubs, huddled in the warm space he'd given them. Her massive form lay still, curled protectively around the small bundles beneath the blanket, her breath a faint rhythm against the chaos outside. Hal's chest ached, a mix of relief and dread as he kept vigil, unable to look away. The wind found every gap, whistling through the cabin like a mournful song, and Hal pulled the blanket tighter, the wool rough against his skin. He'd broken every rule he'd lived by, Walter's rules, the ones carved into him through years of hard lessons. "Don't meddle!" His father's voice rumbled in his mind, stern and unyielding, but it softened as another memory surfaced. "Sometimes, son, the heart knows best," Walter had said once. A rare crack in his armor, and Hal clung to it now, a lifeline in the storm. He glanced at the photographs on the wall, a hawk, a moose, a bear, and wondered what his father would think of this night. Through the window the mother's eyes glinted, still watching him, but the desperate edge had dulled, replaced by a wary calm. The cubs lay motionless, their small chests barely rising, and Hal's stomach twisted. Had he been too late? He'd seen hypothermia claim animals before, watched it through his lens without stepping in, but this was different. This was his doing, his risk. He rose, crossing to the desk, and checked the satellite phone, its screen dark and useless. The ranger station was miles away, unreachable, and he was alone with the choice he'd made, the weight of it settling like snow on his shoulders. The fire crackled, spitting sparks, and Hal returned to the window, pressing a hand to the glass. The shed's heat was working, a faint mist rising from the mother's fur as it thawed, and he let out a breath he hadn't known he'd held. The storm shook the cabin harder, a branch snapping outside with a sound like gunfire. But inside the shed, a miracle was unfolding. The cubs stirred, faint at first, a twitch of a paw, a shift beneath the blanket. Hal's eyes widened, his pulse quickening as the mother nosed them gently, her tongue rasping over their fur, coaxing them back from the edge. He sank back into his chair, the fire's warmth seeping into his bones, but sleep was a distant dream. The mother's gaze never left him, a silent acknowledgment across the glass, and Hal felt a bond he couldn't name, a thread tying him to this family he'd pulled from the cold. The storm's fury peaked, the wind a relentless hammer, but the shed held, its walls a fragile sanctuary. The cubs moved again, stronger now, their small bodies pressing closer to their mother, and Hal's lips curved in a faint, weary smile. They were alive for now, and he'd bought them time, but the night was far from over, and the storm still had teeth to bear. The storm's fury battered the cabin through the early morning, its winds clawing at the walls as if determined to rip them apart. Harold Hal Grayson stood at the connecting window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the shed where the mother bear and her cubs sheltered. The lantern's glow had dimmed, casting the room in a soft half-light, but he could see them clearly now. The cubs stirring beneath the blanket, their small bodies twitching with newfound life. The mother lay curled around them, her massive frame a steadfast guard, her eyes softer than they'd been in the night's darkest hours. Hal's chest swelled with a quiet relief, though his hands still trembled from the cold and the weight of what he'd done. The fire crackled behind him, its warmth a lifeline against the chill seeping through the floorboards, and he rubbed his eyes, exhaustion tugging at him. Dawn had crept in, gray and muted through the snow-thick sky, and the cub's recovery unfolded like a slow miracle. One pawed at the blanket, a weak but deliberate motion, while the other shifted closer to its mother, a faint whimper escaping its throat. She responded instantly, her tongue rasping over their fur, coaxing them back with a tenderness that belied her size. Hal watched, transfixed as their movements grew stronger, their small chests rising and falling with steadier breaths. He turned to the desk, retrieving a jug of water and a tin of dried meat from his supplies. The storm still raged, trapping them all, and he knew they'd need more than warmth to survive. Moving quietly, he waited until the mother's eyes drifted shut, her breathing slowing in a rare moment of rest. He eased the shed door open, the wind's bite sharp against his face, and placed the offerings just inside, retreating before she stirred. Back in the cabin, he peered through the window, holding his breath as she roused, her snout twitching at the scent. She glanced at him, wary but not hostile, and nudged the meat toward her cubs, a cautious acceptance settling between them. The wind howled louder, rattling the cabin's frame, and Hal sank into his chair, pulling the blanket tighter. Walter's voice echoed in his mind, stern as ever. "Don't meddle, Hal." But as he watched the mother tear the meat into smaller pieces for her cubs, he felt a shift, a trust, fragile as the ice outside, forming in her steady gaze. Ruth's words followed, softer, insistent. "They have souls." He'd scoffed at her once, but now, seeing the mother's care, her quiet strength, he wondered if she'd been right all along. The cubs ate, their movements clumsy but eager, and Hal's lips curved in a faint smile, though it faded as quickly as it came. The storm showed no sign of relenting, its roar a constant drumbeat against the walls. Hal glanced at the photographs, wolves, bears, moments he'd captured without touching, and felt the weight of this night settle deeper. He'd crossed a line, invited danger into his world, and yet the sight of those cubs, alive when they'd been so close to death, stirred something he couldn't name. The mother's eyes met his again, no longer desperate, but calm, almost knowing, and Hal felt a bond take root, a shared survival he hadn't sought but couldn't deny. He rose, stoking the fire, and listened as the wind found a new pitch, a shrill wail that set his nerves on edge. The cubs were stronger now, their whimpers turning to soft grunts as they pressed against their mother. But the storm's grip held firm. Hal knew they couldn't leave yet, not with the snow piling higher and the cold sinking deeper. He settled back into his chair, the blanket rough against his skin, and kept watch, the night stretching on with a promise of more to come. More risk, more connection, and a test he wasn't sure she'd pass. The second day of the storm dawned gray and heavy, the snow a thick shroud that muffled the world beyond the cabin's walls. Harold Hal. Grayson leaned against the connecting window, his breath a faint mist as he watched the shed. The cubs were awake now, their small bodies moving with a restless energy that belied the night's ordeal. One batted at the blanket, tumbling over in a clumsy roll, while the other nosed at an old camera case, toppling it with a soft thud. Hal's lips twitched, a flicker of amusement cutting through his fatigue, but it faded as he saw the mother bear shift, her massive frame tensing with a new alertness. The wind still raged, though its howl had dulled to a steady roar, and the fire behind him crackled, its heat a thin shield against the cold seeping through. The cub's play was a sign of life, a victory he'd fought for, but it brought a new unease. They were growing comfortable, too comfortable, in this space he'd made for them. He thought of Eleanor, the old ranger from Elkins, her voice sharp in his memory. "Don't meddle with nature, Hal. You'll regret it." She'd seen bears turn dependent, linger too long near humans, and he'd nodded then, agreeing from a distance. Now, her warning felt like a weight on his chest, pressing harder with each tumble of the cubs. The mother bear rose, pacing the shed's small space, her snout sniffing the air as if testing the storm's pulse. Her eyes flicked to the window, meeting Hal's, and he saw a restlessness there, a wildness stirring beneath her calm. She pawed at the door, a low rumble in her throat, and Hal's stomach tightened. She wanted out, her instincts pulling her back to the forest, but the blizzard held them captive. He glanced at the thermometer, still frozen, useless, and knew the cold outside was a death sentence they'd only just escaped. Yet keeping them here risked something else, a bond that could unravel the balance he'd always respected. He turned to the desk, retrieving more water and meat, and repeated his quiet ritual, slipping the supplies inside while she slept. She woke as he retreated, her gaze steady as she accepted the offering, but she waited until he was gone, before eating. A delicate dance of trust and distance. Hal watched from the cabin, the lantern's light dimming as the day wore on, and felt the tension grow. The cubs were stronger, their play louder, and one knocked over a stack of old film cans, the clatter sharp against the wind's drone. He winced, half laughing, half dreading the chaos they could bring. The fire sputtered and Hal added a log, the flames leaping briefly before settling. Walter's voice returned, a gruff reprimand. "You've gone too far, son." But Ruth's followed, gentle and sure. "You'll see their souls." He rubbed his face, caught between them, and looked at the photographs. A bear in a meadow, free and wild, not caged by his hand. The mother paced again, her movements sharper, and Hal knew the storm's end would force a choice. He couldn't keep them, not without breaking something fundamental, but letting them go felt like severing a thread he'd only just found. The wind shifted, a faint lessening in its roar, and Hal's eyes narrowed, sensing the storm's grip loosening. The cubs tumbled together, their energy a stark contrast to the mother's growing agitation, and he felt the clock ticking. The night ahead would test him again, not just his courage, but his understanding of where he fit in this fragile dance with the wild. He settled into his chair, the blanket slipping, and watched them through the glass. A man on the edge of a decision he couldn't yet name. The storm's roar softened as the third morning broke. A pale light filtering through the snow-heavy clouds over the Appalachian ridge. Harold Howell. Grayson stood at the cabin's window, his breath a faint mist against the glass as he watched the world outside transform. The wind had eased to a low moan, the drifts piling high but no longer swirling in chaos. The thermometer, thawed by the rising sun, crept up to -10 degrees Fahrenheit, a brutal cold still, but a reprieve from the killing depths of the past nights. Inside, the fire crackled, its warmth steady now, and Hal felt the shift in the air, a promise that the worst had passed. He turned to the connecting window, peering into the shed, where the mother bear and her cubs had sheltered. The cubs were lively, tumbling over each other in bursts of energy, their small paws batting at the blanket and the scattered remnants of Hal's old gear. The mother stood near the door, her massive frame restless, her snout pressed to the crack as she sniffed the changing weather. Her eyes flicked to Hal, sharp and alert, and he saw the wildness stirring, a call to the forest she couldn't ignore. The storm had held them, but its grip was breaking, and with it, the fragile truce they'd forged. Hal pulled on his coat, the wool stiff against his skin, and stepped outside, the cold biting his face as he crossed to the shed's outer door. The snow crunched under his boots, a crystalline crust glinting in the sunlight, and he paused, listening to the cubs' soft grunts through the wood. He'd saved them, pulled them from death's edge, but now the balance teetered. Eleanor's voice echoed in his mind, gruff and certain. "Don't let them stay too long, Hal. They'll forget what they are." He'd nodded to her once, years ago, but now, with the mother's gaze burning through the glass, he felt the weight of that warning. He turned the latch, easing the door open, and stepped back, giving her space. Fresh air rushed in, crisp and sharp, and the mother lifted her head, her nostrils flaring as she tested it. The cubs froze, their play halting, and then bounded toward her, drawn by her sudden stillness. She moved with a grace that belied her size, stepping onto the snow, her fur steaming faintly in the cold. The cubs followed, tumbling out with eager leaps, their small bodies sinking into the drifts. Hal watched, his chest tightening, a mix of relief and something heavier, a pang he couldn't name. The mother paused, her paws sinking deep, and turned her head toward the forest. The oaks stood tall, their branches heavy with ice, a path opening where the storm had carved its way. She took a step, then another, the cubs trailing her, their energy spilling out in clumsy bounds. Hal stood at a distance, the wind tugging at his coat, and felt the moment stretch. A farewell he hadn't prepared for. The shed door creaked behind him, a hollow sound, and he glanced back at the empty space, the blankets crumpled where they'd lain. They were leaving, and he knew it was right, but the ache lingered. The cubs darted ahead, chasing each other through the snow, their near-death forgotten in the way of the young. The mother followed, slower, her stride steady now, a strength reborn in the sunlight. Hal's eyes tracked them, his hands flexing in his gloves, and he wondered if they'd remember this, the warmth, the meat, the man who'd opened a door. The forest loomed closer, its shadows swallowing the cubs' dark forms, and he took a step forward, then stopped. This was their world, not his, and he'd done what he could. The wind whispered through the trees, softer now, and he waited, knowing there was one last moment to come. The sun climbed higher, its light scattering across the snow in a shimmer of gold and white, painting the Appalachian Ridge in a fleeting beauty. Harold Hal Grayson stood at the edge of his porch, the cold seeping through his boots, as he watched the mother bear and her cubs near the forest's embrace. The cubs bounded ahead, their small bodies weaving through the drifts, their play a stark contrast to the stillness of the night they'd nearly lost. The mother moved behind them, her massive frame cutting a path through the snow, her fur catching the sun in glints of black and silver. Hal's breath hung in the air, a faint cloud as he felt the weight of their departure settle into his bones. The wind had faded to a murmur, the storm's echoes lingering in the creak of the oaks and the drip of melting ice. Hal's eyes followed the cubs, their energy a testament to the life he'd fought to save. But it was the mother who held him. She reached the tree line, her paws sinking into the softer snow beneath the branches, and paused, her head turning back toward him. Their eyes met across the distance, a silent thread stretching between them, and Hal felt his throat tighten. There was no desperation now, no plea, just a steady, knowing look, a recognition that pierced him deeper than the cold ever could. He stood still, the porch boards creaking under his weight, and saw something in her gaze he'd never captured through his lens. It wasn't gratitude, not in the human sense, but an acknowledgement, a shared moment of survival that transcended the divide between them. The cubs darted into the shadows, their grunts fading as they explored the woods, and the mother lingered, her presence commanding even at this distance. Hal's mind flashed to Ruth, her voice soft over coffee. "They have souls, Hal." He doubted her then, but now in the mother's eyes he saw it, a depth, a will, a life that mirrored his own in ways he couldn't explain. The forest swallowed the cubs, their dark forms blending into the trees, and the mother took a step forward, then stopped again. Hal's heart thudded, a quiet ache spreading through him as he realized this was goodbye. He'd broken every rule, Walter's rules, Eleanor's warnings, and risked everything to pull them through, and now they were leaving as they should. The sun glinted off her fur, a final flare of light, and she turned fully, facing him one last time. The moment held, time slowing in the crisp air, and Hal felt a connection he'd carry forever, a bond forged in the storm's heart, fragile yet unbreakable. She moved then, her stride sure and graceful, leading her cubs deeper into the woods. Hal watched, his hands clenched in his pockets as their shapes grew smaller, the snow closing over their tracks. The wind brushed his face, softer now, and he stood there long after they'd gone, the silence settling like a blanket over the ridge. The shed door swayed faintly, a reminder of the night that had changed him, and he turned back to the cabin, the fire's glow calling him in. They were gone, back to their world, but they'd left something behind, a piece of him he hadn't known he'd given. He stepped inside, the warmth wrapping around him, and paused at the window, gazing at the forest edge. The trees stood sentinel, their branches swaying in the breeze, and Hal felt a quiet peace settle in, a peace born of risk, of reaching out when he could have turned away. The cubs were safe, the mother strong again, and he'd been part of it, a bridge between their lives and his. The day stretched ahead, bright and cold, and he knew this moment would linger, a memory sharper than any photograph he'd ever taken. The years slipped by like snow melting into the Appalachian streams, each season blending into the next, until Harold Hal Grayson's hair turned a deeper gray, his steps slower on the cabin's worn porch. It was a crisp winter morning now, a decade since that storm had roared down the ridge, and the air carried a familiar bite, though gentler than that fateful night. The thermometer outside his window hovered at -5 degrees Fahrenheit, a quiet cold compared to the brutal depths he'd once faced. Hal stood by the fire, its crackle a steady companion, and gazed at the photographs lining the walls. Wolves, moose, bears. Images frozen in time, their stories silent but vivid in his memory. He'd stayed in the cabin all these years, rooted to this solitary outpost in West Virginia's mountains, the nearest town of Elkin still a distant hum on clear days. The world beyond had moved on. Pittsburgh's galleries no longer whispered his name, his old life as a wildlife photographer a faded echo, but Hal had found something here, something deeper than fame or flashbulbs. The forest stretched beyond his window, its oak standing tall against a sky brushed with dawn, and he watched it now, a ritual as old as his time in this place. The snow lay thick, a fresh blanket over the ridge, and he wondered, as he often did, about the family he'd sheltered that desperate night. The storm had changed him, carved a mark into his soul he couldn't erase. He'd seen bears since then, dark shapes moving through the trees in summer dusk or spring's green haze, and each time his heart skipped, a question flickering in his mind. Were they hers? The mother bear and her cubs had vanished into the forest that third morning, their tracks swallowed by the snow, and he'd never sought them out. He'd let them go as he'd known he must, but their memory lingered, sharp and clear. A story he carried in his chest rather than his camera. Hal turned from the window, crossing to the desk where his satellite phone sat, its screen dark and unused. The shed still stood, its door creaking in the wind. A relic of that night when he'd broken every rule Walter had drilled into him. "Don't meddle, Hal." His father's voice rumbled in his memory, stern and unyielding. A woodsman's creed from a man who'd lived by the land's harsh laws. But Walter's words had softened over time, reshaped by that rare moment of vulnerability. "Sometimes, son, the heart knows best." Hal smiled faintly, the fire's warmth seeping into his bones, and knew his father would have understood in the end. He'd abandoned photography after that winter, the camera gathering dust on a shelf, its lens no longer a shield between him and the wild. The photographs on the walls were enough, moments he'd captured before he'd learned that some things were better felt than framed. Ruth's voice drifted through his thoughts, soft over the clink of diner cups. "They have souls, Hal." He doubted her then, laughed it off as whimsy, but the mother bear's eyes had proven her right, exhausted, desperate, then steady with a trust he hadn't earned but had been given. That gaze had stayed with him, a quiet teacher in the years that followed. The cabin creaked as a gust brushed the ridge, softer than the storm's savage howl, but enough to stir the past. Hal moved to the porch, pulling his coat tight, and stepped into the cold, the snow crunching under his boots. The forest loomed ahead, its branches heavy with ice, and he scanned the tree line, a habit born of that night. He'd never seen her again, not for certain, but there were moments. A bear's silhouette against a sunset, a pair of cubs wrestling in a clearing, that made him pause, his breath catching as he wondered. They'd survived, he told himself, their strength reborn in the shed's warmth, and that was enough. He leaned against the railing, the wood rough under his hands, and let his mind drift back to that final glance. She'd stood at the forest's edge, the cubs bounding ahead, and turned to him, her eyes locking with his across the snow. It wasn't gratitude, not in any human way, but a recognition, a shared thread of survival that had bound them in the storm's heart. Hal had felt it then, a connection beyond species, a moment when the wild and the man had met and understood. She'd turned away, leading her cubs into the trees, and he'd watched until they'd faded, the silence settling like a balm over his soul. The sun climbed higher now, its light scattering across the snow in a dance of gold and white, and Hal's gaze softened. The cubs would be grown if they'd lived. Strong bears roaming these hills, their mother's legacy carved into the land. He pictured them, imagined her teaching them the forest's secrets, her powerful frame guiding them through seasons he'd never see. The thought warmed him, a quiet pride in the part he'd played, and he knew he'd make the same choice again. Rules be damned. Eleanor's warning, "Don't let them stay too long," had been right in its way, but letting them go had been its own kind of courage. He stepped back inside, the fire's glow wrapping around him, and settled into his chair, the blanket slipping over his shoulders. The cabin was quieter now, the wind a whisper through the oaks, and Hal felt a peace he'd earned through that night's risk. He'd been a bridge, a fleeting link between their world and his, and it had redefined him, not just a survivor, but a man who'd reached out when he could have turned away. The photograph stared back, their stillness a contrast to the memory that lived in him, and he closed his eyes, letting it play out. The wind's howl, the cub's shivers, the mother's steady gaze. The day stretched ahead, bright and cold, and Hal knew he'd stay here, tethered to this ridge until his own seasons ran out. The forest held its secrets, the bears its silent keepers, and he was content to let them be. He'd seen them once, close enough to touch, and that was a gift he'd carry to his last breath. The fire sputtered, a log shifting with a soft thud, and Hal opened his eyes, glancing at the window. A shadow moved in the distance, a bear, solitary, its form blurred by the trees, and he smiled, a faint curve of his lips. Was it her? He'd never know, and that was as it should be. The snow fell lightly now, a gentle dusting over the ridge, and Hal leaned back, the blanket warm against his skin. The storm had been a crucible, a test of heart over head, and he'd emerged different, quieter, surer, a man who'd found meaning in the wild's embrace. Walter's rules had guided him. Ruth's faith had opened him, and the mother bear had taught him. Survival wasn't just enduring, but honoring the fragile threads that tied all life together. He looked at the forest one last time, its edges softening in the morning light, and felt the story close. A chapter ended, but never forgotten. The cabin settled around him, its creaks a familiar song, and Hal rested, the fire's glow a steady pulse in the room. The bears were out there, living their wild lives, and he was here, a witness to their strength, a keeper of their tale. The snow fell on, the ridge stood firm, and Hal knew he'd done right by them, by her, by the cubs, by the man he'd become. The silence wrapped him like a friend, and he let it hold him, the memory of that night a lantern in the dark, burning bright and true. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.